Boo! And welcome to a Halloween episode of Cocktail Papa. I do love an occasion to share a new drink with friends and family, so I am capitalizing on Halloween to share a drink with you called a zombie. This is also a continuation of a tiki theme I started last week with the Mai Tai, and will continue next week with the red versus blue election night cocktails, also tiki themed. The zombie was created in 1934 by a guy named Don the Beachcomber. There was a lot of mysticism around tiki drinks at that time, and probably still continues to be a little bit of mysticism there, in that some more glib bartenders, if you ask them what's in a specific drink, they'll say something like rum and juice. And while that's not inaccurate, it isn't super helpful in trying to create a drink like this at home. And so I'll admit that there's not actually a whole lot that's spooky about today's episode, beyond maybe the idea that there's 10 ingredients in this drink that may feel a little scary to some at home. But we'll talk through each ingredient and why they're there and what they do. There's 3 different rums, there's 2 different fruit juices, there's 2 different homemade syrups, there's some bitters, there's some absinthe. This is a complicated build, but step by step, we'll get through it together. The recipe you'll see below actually only calls for 9 items, but one of them is something called Don's Mix, so Don the Beachcomber, Don's Mix. And that's made up of grapefruit juice as well as some homemade cinnamon syrup. That was part of the early mysticism. You'd have bottles labeled Don's Mix or Zombie Blend, so it wouldn't say what rums were in that mix. This always makes me think of that scene in Space Jam where there's Michael's special stuff in that squirt bottle. Maybe it felt a little bit like that, but pre-Space Jam in the 1930s. So I'll put some recipes for that down below, as well as the homemade Grenadine I made earlier this week. Next, I'll introduce some of the ingredients that we haven't talked about before on this channel, and then also explain why I'm using 3 different rums. Tiki by nature is usually a little bit extra. You're not going to see a hard and fast definition of what tiki is out there, but it's usually characterized by exciting garnishes, usually bright tropical colors, cool glassware, or sometimes even like mugs that have a picture of a zombie, or it'll be a sculpture of a mermaid, or a steering wheel of a boat. There's all kinds of loosely nautically themed ideas, or different sorts of lore connected to the sea. So we'll certainly touch on some of those ideas today. I don't have a zombie mug. I'm going to be using kind of a tall, skinny beer glass with a short foot on it. So yeah, let's discuss the 3 rums I'm using today. The recipe traditionally calls for a gold column still rum. Sometimes it'll call it a Puerto Rican rum, sometimes a Cuban rum. The rum that I'm using is from a distillery called Mount Gay. This is called Eclipse, and it isn't a true column still rum. It's a pot and column blend. It's a somewhat less intense, less funky tasting rum that's a great base for this cocktail. Maybe not quite as neutral as a Puerto Rican like Don Q Gold or Bacardi 8 or something like that, but it's a rum that I really like, and it serves as a great basis for what I'm doing. Oh, I'll also note that the 3 rums that I'm using are not the exact 1934 base, but I've kind of tried to rebalance them in a way that makes sense for both my palate and also the rums that I actually have in my house. So this one takes the place, like I said, of that Puerto Rican gold rum. And if you have a Puerto Rican gold rum, by all means use that. But this is one that I really like, and it serves as a great base. So this is the one that I'm using as a Jamaican pot still rum. This truly is a Jamaican pot still rum, but I would imagine most people making this recipe wouldn't use a Navy strength or 57% ABV rum. I'm accounting for it with the next rum choice, which I'll describe in a little bit. But another one that I've used in a different episode was the Plantation Jamaica, which is also a great Jamaican pot still rum, nice ester profile. This one's just a little bit more punchy, a little bit more intense. The reason all 3 of the rums I'm using are a little bit of a departure is because once you move one, you kind of have to bring your whole balance back into spec. And so if there's folks that want to leave any notes in the comments as to what rums they have at home and how they might get some advice balancing rums, feel free to shoot that through. And this one balances well with what I'm using here. That's called Wray and Nephew. I've got these cute little bottles. Look at these little guys. Only because I couldn't find the 750 and I was able to get a 12-pack of these little bottles. Generally, also in the recipe, this would be the place of the 151 Demerara rum. And so this one is not Demerara. It's not quite as, it's not as aged. There's not that like caramel intensity that you would get in a Demerara rum. And also this one's a little bit lower proof. So even though this one is Wray and Nephew Overproof, this is 63% ABV, whereas the 151 would be 75.5% ABV. So I'm I've balanced it by bringing the Jamaican pot still rum up and by bringing the 151 down. But these are also just rums that I really like the flavors of, and they work really well together. So that's the most important part. Okay, now we'll talk briefly about a couple of syrups. This cinnamon syrup is one that is a 1-to-1 ratio, so it's equal parts sugar and water, and then simmered on the stove for just a minute or so with the cinnamon sticks, and then I let it cool with the cinnamon sticks and also just sit in this jar. I won't be pouring from this jar today because, like I said, the cinnamon syrup is mixed with grapefruit juice, 2 parts grapefruit juice to 1 part cinnamon syrup for this bottle. I should have labeled it, but it's Don's Mix is what the recipe calls for. And then this one over here is my homemade grenadine. So this is, you can find lots of different recipes. Jeffrey Morgenthaler has a great one. They're all fairly similar. The main thing that you'll find different is the amount of sugar that's used. And so some people will call for a semi-rich syrup, meaning 1.5 parts sugar to 1 part water, or in this case, juice. So the main thing I wanted to call out is juice. Syrups that are made with a fruit juice generally use the fruit juice in place of the water. And so I used 1 part pomegranate juice to 2 parts sugar, and then also topped it up with a little bit of pomegranate molasses as well as some orange blossom water. So this is a really nice tasting, nice density to it. I think grenadine maybe gets a bad rap for being kind of a boring pink sugar water, but something like this that is made with real pomegranate juice and real pomegranate molasses has plenty of punch, and it's actually an interesting component in the drink. Oh, I didn't talk about falernum yet. Get it? Like it's scary. Velvet Falernum is a specific brand of falernum. Falernum it can be either a syrup or it can be a liqueur. If it's a liqueur, that means it has a rum base to it, in addition to lime peel, almond, and clove. This is one that's made on the island of Barbados, made with rum. It's fairly low ABV. It's only 11% ABV. I think the rum is mainly there for the preservative effect of it, although it does give a little bit of a fun flavor as well. That's pretty much everything I'll be using. There's a couple of modifiers that I'm kind of using in like dash formats. One is just classic Angostura bitters. Angostura bitters are actually from Trinidad and Tobago. And so even though we think of Angostura as like a whiskey ingredient that we put into an old fashioned, it has very much its foot in the tiki canon as well. And we also have a little bit of absinthe. Absinthe, we're just using a couple dashes of. I don't have a dasher bottle spare handy for absinthe, so I'm just going to be using a scant bar spoon. I've got a bar spoon here for measuring that. And then also we've got some lime juice fresh in the jar. I'm going to build this one in reverse order of how I normally build them, but this is actually the correct order for how most professional bartenders would probably build a drink. I normally start with the spirit base and then work my way down to the lower quantity ingredients, but oftentimes professional bartenders will start with bitters to make sure they don't forget them. And also, if they're going to make a mistake, they'd rather make a mistake with some of the ingredients that cost a little less. So if you accidentally grab the wrong bitters bottle, you don't want to be scrapping 2 ounces of a bottled and bond rye whiskey or something like that. I'm doing it this way today, mainly so we don't forget anything. It's easier to tell what's in there once you're starting with the smaller ingredients versus building your way up. So I'm going to go from Angostura bitters and then do the absinthe and then do some other syrups, and then I'll actually finish with the rums today. So starting with Angostura bitters, I'm going to give it 1 good dash. Full bar spoon is going to be about 1/6 of an ounce. I want a little bit less than that. Here is the grenadine, and we're going to be doing 1/4 ounce of grenadine. Doesn't sound like a lot of sweeteners, but there's 3 different sweeteners in this drink. We also need 1/2 ounce of Velvet Falernum. We need 1/2 ounce of Don's Mix. This is what I mentioned, 2 parts grapefruit juice to 1 part cinnamon syrup. We need 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. I just fresh squeezed some limes into the jar as I'm wont to do. And a 3/4 ounce measurement of a lime is nice because I find that's about as much juice as I can get out of a lime. So anytime a recipe calls for 1 ounce of lime, I've got to squeeze 2. Don was thinking of us. Okay, now that's all the juices and the syrups and the funny flavorings. Now we can just focus on the rums. It already smells wild. We're going to use 1 ounce of this Wray and Nephew. Like I said, this is the part of the drink that's normally that 151. Yeah, this rum smells amazing. We're going to do 1.5 ounces of this Smith & Cross. And finally, 1.5 ounces of Mount Gay Eclipse. Now, this is a drink that's actually really hard to over dilute. There's so much sugar and so much rum in there. The first time I made the drink, my wife and I tried it and thought like, oh, that's maybe a little bit too boozy. Maybe I need to reblend the rums. But then it also was too sweet. And so when a drink is both too boozy and too sweet, what it really needs is just dilution. And so I actually poured it back into the shaking tin with a little bit of fresh ice, shook it up harder, even longer to get a little bit more dilution into the drink, chill it down a little bit further. And then once we reserved it in the glass with some fresh crushed ice, it was perfect. So this recipe as is will work great, but also when you're balancing those rums, just keep that in mind. And if you taste it and it's good, but it's just too intense, go ahead and keep shaking, add a little bit more ice, and I think you'll get there. So you'll see this tin is pretty well frosted over. Some bartenders like to say shake until it's too cold to hold. I think that's a good rule of thumb here. And then we'll strain over some fresh crushed ice. For garnish here, I have yet another sad crop of mint, but it'll still give the color pop and it'll give that aroma. It just doesn't have quite the bouquet or like the big palm tree feeling. Tuck that down in there. Cheers. Wow. I know there's 10 ingredients in there, but if you take a sip and you really think about each individual ingredient, you can taste them all. The rum blend is maybe a little bit tricky, especially if you're not familiar with the rums that you have in your cabinet. Picking out those individually may take a little bit more time, but you can taste lime, you can taste grapefruit, you can taste a little hint of cinnamon, you can taste a little bit of that pomegranate from the Grenadine. Wow, yeah, just a great, complex, not actually very spooky drink. Also, you may see here, the name of the brewery that this glass is from is called Burial. Not a very maybe tiki word, but certainly a Halloween word, kind of spooky there. That's all for the zombie today. Like I said, please shoot me questions on this one, whether you want to sub something out or whether you have rum questions or questions on syrups. I know this is maybe a bit more technical than some of the videos we've done in the past, but you can totally do it. Thanks for joining me with this spooky episode. Depending on your feelings towards politics, maybe next week's episode will be just as spooky, if not spookier, but I will keep the politics out of the episode. It's just a fun red versus blue. There'll be a red tiki drink and there'll be a blue tiki drink. And if you guys make them at home, you can have your friends vote on them. I'm not pulling for any specific color. I think they're both really tasty drinks. Just a fun way to maybe distract a little bit from election night. At the end of the day, drinks are for fun. And my goal with this channel is to teach people enough so they can share that fun with the people they love. Come and be amazed at what you can do. Cheers.